Okay, should I start with the introduction? Or should we? Yeah, okay. Welcome everybody. Today's guest speaker for our seminar is Natasha Sekhon. And Natasha is a postdoc and presidential diversity fellow at the University of Brown University, and a visiting scientist at MIT. And some of you might still remember Natasha from her undergraduate, which she did here in the ESS department. From when on, she went to go to the University of Texas, Austin, to complete her master's and PhD. Natasha is trained in using isotope geochemistry, trace elements, statistical analysis, and karst hydrology to understand the geochemistry of stalagmites from caves in the tropics, mainly Colombia and the Philippines. And she's mainly interested in understanding the El Niño Southern Oscillation on several temporal scales. So yeah, welcome. And Natasha, the stage is yours.
Great. Thank you, Annabelle, for the invitation. And I am super excited to talk about the research that I've been doing, a little bit about my postdoctoral work, and I'll talk briefly about some of my PhD work as well. But yeah, so I did start my sort of academic journey at UC Irvine. So it is very exciting to present the research that I started doing with Kathleen Johnson. Yeah, so kind of sad that I couldn't visit in person, maybe sometime down the line in the future, but yeah, I'll get started. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about an integrated source to sink study to understand modern as well as paleotropical hydroclimate variability. I just like throwing these two pictures in to just show the scope and variation of tropical landscapes. The one on the left is taken from a cave in Wyoming, and the one on the right is this massive sinkhole called Callao Cave taken from the Philippines. I will not be talking about these cave systems, but I do like to talk about the range of variability in karst landscapes. So talking about karst landscapes, I have spent the last couple of years looking at this cross-section and trying to understand hydroclimate variability through the processes of karst hydrology. So just a quick refresher, karst landscapes are terrains that are found in limestone and dolomite type of bedrock geology. They are formed through the dissolution of soluble rocks. Around or more than 25% of the world's population either lives or obtains its water from these karst aquifers. It's also super interesting that a source to sink investigation allows us to get a unique understanding of the processes driving climate variability, contaminant hydrogeology, as well as element transport. So today I'm going to give three examples. The first one, I'm going to talk a little bit about the modern climatology, and then follow that with an example of what's happening in the carbonate critical zone. And then finally give an example of the most recent work we've been doing using stalagmites from Colombia and look at paleoclimatology and think about ENSO variability. So I'm interested in understanding hydroclimate variability through time and processes that essentially drive the hydroclimate variability to discern climate sensitivity in a warming world. I think everybody, all of us over here, are familiar with the effects of El Niño and La Niña. This is an example showing El Niño induced droughts in Manila, and then a more recent example of how La Niña impacts the hydroclimate in Colombia. In addition to that, I am also interested in hydrological extreme events such as typhoons and hurricanes that cross Southeast Asia. This is Typhoon Haiyan that hit the Philippines in 2013 and was one of the most devastating typhoons that hit the country. So I do want to go ahead and give a shout out to all the people who have worked on the cave monitoring aspect of things, as well as helping in the lab. I'll be showing some of the results that some of the undergraduate students at Brown that I've been mentoring have helped me piece together. And in addition to that, all of our local collaborators at the different cave systems that help monitor the caves for us sitting on the other side of the world. This is a recent global karst distribution map that was published and that highlights global karst distribution around the world, indicated in the gray shading. In addition to that, the purple hexagons represent published speleothems, as well as the active cave monitoring networks, which are indicated by the Sekhon circles. What you'll notice is the Philippines stands out because it has a lot of karst distribution, but currently there are no actively monitored cave sites. In addition to just one paper that was published, there is a limited understanding of terrestrial paleoclimatology from this region. So this makes a really good, unique spot to go in, set up some monitoring sites, and try and understand terrestrial climatology. In addition to that, about 9% of the total world population lives in Southeast Asia. And according to some recent IPCC reports, the impact of climate change is anticipated to be very drastic for Southeast Asia. Anything that is colored in red, which is the entire country of the Philippines, is very vulnerable to climate change through typhoons that we were just talking about, in addition to drying trends, and which are droughts, and extreme precipitation through landslides and flooding. On the interannual timescale, the El Niño Southern Oscillation drastically affects the Philippines when you have El Niño conditions as suggested by the Niño 3.4 region. There is a high pressure system that sits above the Philippines, which results in a decrease in rainfall amount. Conversely, when you have La Niña conditions, there are low pressure systems sitting above the Philippines, which increase rainfall amount. And these are studies that have been done through atmospheric sciences and climatological perspectives. A recent paper that came out in 2022 actually suggests that ENSO teleconnections are even more uncertain in regions of lower socioeconomic development. So we were really interested in asking the question whether El Niño events impact hydrological. And in this sense, what I mean by hydrological is river discharge and rainfall trends in the Philippines. In addition to interannual timescale variability, the Philippines is also impacted by 4 different types of climate variability on the seasonal scale. Climate type 1, as you can see over here, indicated by rainfall averages, and then on the right panel indicated by discharge averages, has a strong summer monsoon signal, with the monsoon peaking it through July and August. Conversely, climate type 2 has a strong winter monsoon signal, and climate type 3 and 4 do not really have a strong rainfall seasonal signal. So if you look at this map spatially, this is what it looks like, with climate type 1 hugging the western border of the country and climate type 2 hugging the eastern border of the country. So what we did was we paired discharge stations as well as rainfall stations spatially spread throughout the country, covering the 4 different types of climate. The circles indicate the discharge stations, and the stars indicate the rainfall station. This is data that spanned from 1900 to 2020, so we have over 100 years worth of data. Jumping straight in and looking at the results, on the top panel, what you're looking at is sea surface temperature anomaly in degrees Celsius for the ENSO 3.4 region. Anything that's in red are El Niño conditions, and anything that are in blue are La Niña conditions. The dashed line indicates El Niño events, which are sea surface temperatures greater than 1 degree Celsius. And then at the bottom over here, what you're actually seeing now are discharge data for the 4 different climate types. We have historical data and then as well as modern data. How we analyze this data essentially is we took the mean of the discharge data, then the data was standardized, the seasonal signal was removed because we were interested in ENSO variability, and if there were any long-term trends, that was also removed through a regression analysis. We did the exact same thing for the rainfall data, again for the 4 different climate types, and you will notice there is a much more continuous notation of the historical data for rainfall compared to discharge. There is a gap in the 40s and 50s, especially the early 40s, which is when World War II was happening. So we don't have access to that data because that data was not measured or recorded. So something that we were interested in was when we have these El Nino events that are higher than 1 degree Celsius, is there a response in both discharge and rainfall? And is there a bias towards the different climate types if we remove the seasonal signal? And if you look at this maybe figure long enough, you can start piecing out some trends, have your eyes aligned to certain really strong events and see if there is a response in both discharge and or rainfall. But we wanted to quantify that, and one statistical approach that we took was doing a superposed epoch analysis, and those are the results that you're seeing right now. So I will quickly walk you through the results for the SEA. So over here, you're looking on the y-axis, you're looking at modern river discharge anomaly. And then on the x-axis, you're looking at years relative to event year. Anything that is an event is when you have SSTA, sea surface temperature anomaly, greater than 1 degree Celsius. So you have pre-event and then you have post-event. And in addition to that, the different colors over here indicate the different climate types, and the red line for each climate type is the median response. So what you're actually noticing is a decrease post-event in discharge, which is prominent in all the 4 different types of climate, and which is statistically significant as these dashed black lines indicate the significance level. We repeated the exact same statistical analysis on the rainfall data. For rainfall, we had a lot more historical data as well. So we were able to do SEA both on historical data set as well as modern rainfall data set. Similarly, what you're looking at over here is a post-event decrease in the rainfall amount for all the 4 climate types, which was super interesting and something that maybe we were not really expecting. And what you do also notice is that after a certain time has passed and rainfall and river discharge has been decreasing, there is a return back to the mean state for both rainfall and river discharge. So some of the key takeaway from the first section is hydrological means decrease with varying intensities across the Philippine archipelago. We have 100 years of river discharge and rainfall data that track El Nino impacts in the tropics. And interestingly, the effect of El Nino events on hydrological means continues several years after the El Nino event has occurred. I'm going to now talk a little bit about the carbonate critical zone work that we are also doing here at Brown University. So we have set up the first continuous cave monitoring network in the Philippines. We are covering around 10 degrees north to south latitudinal spread by monitoring 3 different cave systems, because again, we are interested in the sort of difference or the bimodal monsoon system where the northern part of the country is impacted by the northeastern monsoon system and the southern part is impacted by the southwestern monsoon. In addition to that, we're also hoping to capture typhoon events that cross above the cave system. So we are collecting drip water at least every month or every other month for at least up to 2 years. In addition to that, some of the proxies that we are interested in analyzing for are stable isotope ratios, as well as trace element concentrations, which I will talk a little bit about in the next couple of slides. And we are also actively monitoring the cave meteorology by monitoring cave air carbon dioxide levels, temperature, relative humidity, and drip rate variability. So I'm going to show some of the cave air CO2 results that we have. This is fresh off the press. We got it essentially last week or 2 weeks ago, and we just plotted it and are trying to understand why this cave air CO2 concentrations are so high. So on the x-axis over here, you have time starting from August, which is the tail end of the wet season in the southern part of the country, entering into the dry season, which is the winter time. And on the y-axis over here, we have cave air CO2 concentrations in parts per million. And you can see seasonal or essentially some synoptic variations in the carbon dioxide concentrations, but they do range from about 10,000 parts per million all the way up to 35,000 parts per million. I'm going to transition a little and talk a little bit about the work that I did for my PhD, which inspired the reason why we are monitoring the trace elements that we are in the Philippines. So it all tracks out. Essentially, I was looking at Sitting Bull Falls, which is a cave site in New Mexico. It is super interesting because we can actively monitor the spring that sources the stream, which ultimately ends up as a waterfall under a cave. So what we did was we had a 2-year monitoring of a carbonate system. We collected cave drip waters as well as paired with modern cave calcite. The rainfall variability in this region is primarily affected by the North American monsoon, which happens in the summer. And by looking at the source as well as the sink, it provides a really unique opportunity to analyze both trace element and stable isotope data. So I'm going to jump straight ahead and start talking about the waters and specifically the stable isotopic data for the waters from this system. So what you're looking at over here are 3 panels. The top panel indicates observational temperature as well as rainfall data from the closest station. The orange vertical lines indicate the summer wet season, and on the x-axis you have time. The second panel is essentially showing stable isotopic oxygen data for the waters, and then the last panel, panel C, is indicating hydrogen. The different colors indicate the different systems, where blue are the surface waters, and then the orange are indicating cave drip waters. And what you actually see, despite the strong seasonality in rainfall, there isn't a significant relationship between cave drip water or surface drip water to the storm systems crossing over the summer. In fact, the mean of the surface and the subsurface waters are within 1 standard deviation of each other. So where they don't really show any seasonal sensitivity, when you actually plot them on the global meteoric waterline, what you actually see is a strong evaporation trend line. So what you're looking at over here is a bivariate plot of delta O18 in VSMO, because we're looking at waters on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis we have delta H2. And again, the notations are carried over, where the orange indicate cave drip water and the blues indicate surface drip water. And what you actually notice is that the cave drip waters are a lot more evaporatively enriched compared to surface waters, which indicate that there is superficial evaporation happening before the water reaches the cave drip site. So from the source all the way to the sink, there is quantitatively evaporation in the system in the semi-arid setting. In addition to stable isotopes, we also looked at trace element data. So I'm going to quickly introduce a concept that maybe some of you already know. So we are looking at, again, a cross-section of that karst landscape where the grays indicate bedrock. If you zoom in and really look at the pore space, what you actually notice over here are voids. Some of the voids are completely full of water and some are not. In cases when you have dry conditions and you have this difference between aqueous and gaseous conditions, you have prior calcite precipitation that occurs, and that is primarily impacting magnesium, barium, and strontium. And when you have prior calcite precipitation, or PCP, the strontium to calcium or magnesium to calcium ratio in the remaining solution increases. So we were interested in seeing how this affects, again, the spring to source systematics for Sitting Bull Falls. And what we actually did a plot of strontium to calcium on the y-axis and then magnesium to calcium on the x-axis. And what you notice over here, again, is that the surface waters are clustered to each other. The slopes are all around 0.8, and conversely, the cave drip waters are clustered further away, and the slopes are ranging from about 0.7 to about 0.9. This again is indicative of prior calcite precipitation occurring through the system, where the cave drip waters have gone through more prior calcite precipitation compared to the surface waters. And another note is the open blue circles are the spring. So that is the source of the cave drip waters and the surface waters. And on the tail end of this plot are your orange circles, which are indicating cave pool water. So this is a really nice plot that is essentially showing that the slopes fall within Sinclair 2012, and that suggests that prior calcite precipitation is the leading mechanism that is influencing or modulating strontium to calcium and magnesium to calcium ratios in this system. So the cave drip waters that are reaching the cave system have already gone through prior calcite precipitation in the surface and within the watershed. So quickly moving from cave drip waters to modern cave calcite, something that we were also interested in looking at was iron to calcium ratios. So that is exactly what you're seeing plotted over here. The two different colors indicate two different sites that we were monitoring within Sitting Bull Falls. And what you actually notice is a sudden increase in the iron to calcium concentrations in modern cave calcite following rainfall events related to the North American monsoon. There is a positive correlation of about R squared of 0.41 that suggests that iron to calcium ratios are increasing following the North American monsoon rain events. And we actually think that a possible model that might be happening over here is when you have in the surface, you have soil moisture, solute, and transition metals such as iron that are bonded, which then get deposited following recharge episodes in the cave system. And we actually saw that in the field itself. So that was super encouraging to see our possible mechanism in action in a way. So this is a picture taken at the beginning of the North American monsoon, taken in May 2018. This is the waterfall and the cave sits right below over here, and the waterfall is barely trickling. It's very clear. And then this event over here captures one of the storm events associated with the North American monsoon at the end of the season. Picture was taken in September of 2018, and you see this drastic change in the environment from the water no longer being clear. It's super chocolatey and completely loaded with these transition metals that then get deposited into the cave system. So this is an interesting way and a possibly new way of looking at paleo flood events from stalagmites that are sitting under systems that do see a lot of flood activities, whether it be related to recharge episodes associated with the North American monsoon or potentially flooding associated with typhoon systems. So we're going to revisit the global karst distribution plot and change our view to Colombia, another region that has a lot of karst, but again, there are minimal or hardly any published terrestrial paleoclimate speleothem studies from Colombia. And this is again a country that is affected by two rainy seasons. You have the movement of the summer ITCZ and the winter ITCZ. Bogota is placed over there. I'll be showing you results from Cueva de la Fabrica, which is a cave system. The closest monitoring station is La Palma, and you can really see this bimodal distribution on a seasonal scale. In addition to that, ENSO variability also affects the hydroclimate over here, with El Nino conditions promoting droughts and flooding conditions prevailing in the La Nina period. So a recent study by the World Bank Group essentially suggested that there is an increase in floods, landslides, as well as coastal floods within the country of Colombia, and all of them are high. There is a high risk of an increase. Coupled with the effects of ENSO, the risks of floods and landslides are likely to increase in the near future. So we were interested in reconstructing a paleoclimate record from this from Colombia. So I'm actually going to skip that slide and jump straight ahead. So this is work that an undergraduate student who was visiting us through the REU program, Christina Marsh, spearheaded. We are looking at a speleothem sample C2A. It's on its side, essentially. So this is the top of the stalagmite, and you're going deeper back in time. The stalagmite was drilled at 50 micrometer resolution, and based on our age model, we're actually looking at 2 years per data point. We think the data was deposited likely under isotopic equilibrium conditions, and in addition to that, this is the first high-resolution terrestrial paleoclimate record from Colombia. This is the record in itself, so I'm going to talk a little bit about it. On the x-axis, you're looking at time. So we're going from about 3100 to around 3700. The blue indicates delta O18, and the green indicates on the secondary axis delta C13. If you're looking at delta O18, the drier conditions are indicated by the more positive values, and then the wetter conditions are indicated by the more negative values. We observe approximately a 1 per mil range of variability with the mean value, and this will become important in a minute, of minus 7.6 per mil. Okay, something that you might be thinking about is this looks like the data is highly correlated, which might suggest that there's actually kinetic variability or variation or kinetic fractionation that is occurring in the stalagmite. So we did a 10-point running R value, which is indicated by this top panel over here. So essentially you're looking at 10-point running R values of the oxygen and the carbon isotopic profiles. The red horizontal line indicates 0.5 and minus 0.5. And in addition to that, we also calculated a p-value significant at a 0.05 or a 95% significance value. So even though visually one might assume that the two isotopic profiles are highly correlated, there are only certain sections throughout the length of the stalagmite that they are highly correlated and significant, and those periods might not necessarily be showing a paleoclimate record. We have another stalagmite that grew from the exact same cave, from the exact same chamber. We have C8A, and you're looking over here at the cross-section of C8A. The section of interest, which is just this top panel over here, gets super porousy and very crumbly as you go deeper. So we are just focusing on the top 5 centimeters, and that section grew between 1788 through 4081. So there is overlap between C2A-1 and C8A, the two stalagmites from Colombia. The sample was drilled at 250 micrometers, which gives us a resolution or sampling resolution of approximately 1.3 years. Again, looking at the record over here, the delta O18 is indicated by the blue and the primary y-axis, and the delta C13 is indicated by the secondary y-axis in green. And the mean value is within standard deviation of C2A-1 with minus 7.70, and we actually notice a 2 per mil variability in this record. So what happens when you actually start comparing the two? But before we do that, again, visually looking at it, there's this question of whether they're highly correlated or not. So we did a similar test. We did the 10-point running R value of the carbon and oxygen profiles, with the horizontal lines indicating high correlation, and at the bottom over here, we are again looking at the 95% significance level. So again, similarly to C2A-1, there are certain sections of this cave which are highly correlated as well as statistically significant. And if we compared the two records, we're actually looking at a time frame that went from about 3100 through 4000 years before present. with again the drier indicated by the more positive values in oxygen and the wetter indicated by the more negative. What we actually observed is we are working on quantifying these trends through the use of wavelet and spectral analysis, but just right now what we notice is a higher amplitude of hydroclimate variability in C8A, followed by a smaller amplitude of variability and less of any trend in C2-A. And so variability likely drives this change, but that is something that we need to quantify through more statistical analysis. And with that, I am going to wrap up the whirlwind almost of the 3 sections that I talked about. So looking at the modern climatology, we investigated a 100-year paired river discharge and rainfall data in the Philippines, which suggested decreasing trend following El Nino events. For the carbonate critical zone, we looked at an increase in transition metals following monsoon-associated rainfall events. And then finally, we also looked at high-resolution reconstruction of 2 stalagmites from Colombia that likely captured the transition in ENSO variability through the late Holocene. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I have some cool images from the fieldwork that we did in the Philippines, as well as the sort of science behind capturing and measuring water for stable isotopic analysis. And with that, I'm happy to field any questions that anybody has at this point.
Hi, Natasha. Thanks for the very interesting talk. Yeah, may I ask a question on the first part of your talk, the Philippine one? So you
Yes.
mentioned that El Nino can decrease the rainfall river trend for, is that a river or rainfall, a discharge or a rainfall trend by several years, right?
Yes.
So how can that be? How can the, are you talking about the rainfall amount or the discharge trend?
So we're talking about the river discharge. Yeah, so essentially, and again, this is not, I should point out by saying this is not a single El Nino event. So we aggregated all El Nino events that covered the time period of interest. And this is an average aggregate response to the to El Nino events.
So after El Nino event, the discharge will have a decreasing trend for several years.
Yes, and we talk about that in the discussion of the paper, most likely highlighting that there is maybe a compounding of effects. So if there's that high pressure system that's sitting above the Philippines that decreases the rainfall amount, that just gets compounded. And if you have low rainfall amount, that leads to a decrease in the river discharge. And it takes a while for the river discharge to come back up to the pre-El Nino event mean state.
I see. Interesting. The second question is, you separate the rainfall into 4 types, right?
Yes.
So where is the typhoon? Type 1 is the summer monsoon. Type 2 is winter monsoon. So where is the typhoon? In which type? Type 3 or type 4? You mentioned typhoon too, right, in your talk?
Yes. Yeah. So we're interested in typhoons as well. I've not looked at that yet. So that primarily affects type 1 and type 2. And there's a graduate student currently looking at how La Nina and flood events respond or modulate river discharge. And I think that's where typhoons will become super important. And how do you separate typhoons from periods of flooding associated to La Nina? So I think that's something that's down the pipeline and it's currently being worked on.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We definitely have time for more questions if anyone is interested. I actually also have a question. So you mentioned PCP. I was wondering, do you have an estimate whether PCP mainly happens in this particular cave in the epicast, or whether it can also happen on the cave ceiling?
Yeah, so I think it's most likely happening on the cave ceiling rather than the epikarst, and I don't have a good picture of that. One of the primarily reasons for that is, actually I do, the epikarst of this cave system is very shallow, and there are pools of water that sit above it. So it's almost likely always saturated unless you get the pools drastically decrease, which would then lead to higher possibility of PCP in the epikarst.
Okay, interesting. And do you think that can influence the dilatation or signal in your stalagmite?
Yeah, I think most definitely likely. So that's the reason why for this paper and the stalagmite, we are essentially just looking at trace elements and not looking at the delta O18 values, because that most likely is impacting the delta O18 and the delta C13.
Thank you.
I also have a question. Thanks for a great talk, Natasha. It's about this component, the sort of middle component. You mentioned looking at or how PCP affects barium. I was wondering if you measured that as well in the surface and drip waters, and if they behave similarly, like in those plots you were showing of strontium versus magnesium.
Yeah, so those plots were like, yeah. So barium pretty much does the same thing as strontium. Over here, I've just shown strontium to calcium in normal log and magnesium to calcium. But yeah, barium pretty much does what strontium does, and it's really cool and really nice to see this really nice evolution of PCP from the surface waters all the way to cave drip waters. But yeah, barium does something similar. Yeah.
Cool. And then your stalagmites from Colombia, you mentioned the trace elements. Have you measured them yet? And if you have, what do they look like?
We have not measured trace elements yet, but we most likely will, because the carbon signal for the two stalagmites are very different. So that I think doing trace elements, that might tell us something about PCP that's happening and affecting carbon. But so far, we've not done that. No.
Look forward to seeing it.
Yep.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your awesome talk today, Natasha. Are there any final questions? If not, we can wrap up. Okay, perfect. All right. Thank you so much.
Great. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.